Um, really quickly is anybody right now having any problems or issues that we should address?
Do you know that it says meeting is now streaming live on YouTube?
Yes, that's how it's being recorded.
Okay.
Now I feel really self-conscious.
Does anyone have any questions or concerns?
Nope. Seems pretty straightforward.
You're unmuted now. You can. So what'll happen is it'll periodically be muted, but you should always have the ability to mute or unmute yourself when you have comments. It's just generally it's better to mute. Otherwise, the collective background noise, it starts to pick that up. Okay, so I guess just briefly, welcome back. Obviously, this is an unusual situation, but we'll try and move forward as productively as we can. Just a couple of things to point out. As I mentioned, if you have issues participating in these synchronous meetings, just contact me and we'll figure out a way forward. It is a seminar class, so it is largely discussion based, but, understandably everybody's schedules have been completely scrambled. We're all juggling things we weren't previously juggling. My daughter's singing in the bathtub about 30 steps from here. If you have any issues participating in these live sessions, just let me know and we'll figure out a way forward. I also these, if you're in a situation where your internet access is a little spotty or whatever, you can call into these. We always have the same meeting ID. I posted it there on in the email. So if you're in a situation where you can't get consistent internet access, that may be an option as well. So just be aware of that. The other thing, as we just mentioned a minute or two ago, is that these are going to be recorded, so you can review these, if you're in a pinch where you just can't make one or whatever. The takeaway is, as much as possible, we want to try and, maintain the seminar aspect of this course, but because people are in different situations now, if that's not going to be an option, we'll just have to individually figure out a way for you to be able to complete the course, right, without it. So just be aware of that, and don't be afraid to contact me. I already had a couple of folks email me about potential internet issues and that kind of thing. So don't be afraid to contact me about that. There's some solution here we can find. We're all just kind of, figuring out the answers to the problems as they come up, since this is such a strange situation, although not completely unusual for us. It's not like we haven't been through stuff sort of like this before. Okay, so bearing that in mind, let's go ahead and take a look at where we are and where we're going, since it's been a couple of weeks. So today we're going to pick back up with the medieval period. It's really
Can I sneak in a question since everybody's here? Yes. I deal with stress by getting things done quick. So I would really love to do my presentation. I don't have to present it until I'm supposed to present it, but I would really like to do it just in case I get sick later. Yeah. So I want Virginia Woolf or I want Ethazula. Does anyone have a problem with any of those, the people that are going before me? Are you guys, anybody doing those already?
Anybody doing, who was it, Virginia Woolf or Gloria Anzaldúa?
Yeah, one of those.
I planned on doing Anzaldúa, and we go on the same day.
I can do Virginia Woolf.
Okay.
Okay, I'm glad I asked.
It wouldn't be unheard of for people to do the same one anyway.
I'm good. I was happy to do either one.
Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to bring that up because we're presenting on the same day. I didn't want it to be the same thing twice.
I'm glad I said something.
And just to sort of underscore that, so those are both folks who are in our modern postmodern section of our book. And the way that that's going to work, you'll notice that's our last day, and there isn't a precise dedication of who we're covering the way there is with most of the other periods. The reason why is if you've taken a look at that section, there are just a lot of folks there. There's just a lot of options. Ideally, we'd have more time to cover all of these people or most of these people, but we don't. So the way that'll work is we'll have folks individually select any 3 people from this section. And that way, when we discuss, ideally, we'll get, a pretty good coverage. People will be talking about different thinkers. So we'll have those represented. This will be a few weeks after you both present. So there's nothing stopping folks from selecting Wolf or Anzaldúa or anything based upon your presentations or anything like that. So there shouldn't actually fell. But we can at least have a date where it's like, oh, okay, this was the last Western Roman Empire emperor. Although even that's disputed because it was 2 guys. Even though it was still ostensibly thriving in the East for another, 1,000 years. I mean, it didn't really stop. The Eastern Roman Empire didn't really stop until the 1400s. And then, also the Catholic Church, which is in a sense kind of can be seen as taking on some of the mantle of the Roman Empire. So sometimes we get sort of clean dates, but like between the medieval and the Renaissance, it's a little bit tougher to say which is which. De Pizan is certainly a kind of transitional figure where we see, I mean, when you read De Pizan, you read about her life, you don't think, well, this is a medievalist, right? You think this is someone who's more modern than that. I mean, she was, she's commonly seen as sort of an early feminist. So you don't tend to associate those things with what we sometimes call the Dark Ages. So the division between those two is a little tough. And in fact, Erasmus, who we cut out, is also kind of a transitional figure, although we'd probably see him more as a Renaissance person. I think the book puts him in the Renaissance because he's really talking about what tend to be seen as sort of humanist ideals. And that does tend to be something we parse up with the medieval, and the Renaissance is, this shift towards humanism, which doesn't necessarily mean secular humanism, but it's a renewed interest in the human. So you'll see things like interest in the human subject, things like autobiography, just noticing the self.
So autobiography didn't happen prior?
It did, but you see things even like Augustine's Confessions, right? But we start to see the sort of the genre of things like autobiography start to take hold in the Renaissance. I mean, it's one of the things we use to make that demarcation is a new interest in the self, the human, as kind of a measure of things. So we'll see this push into humanism, ostensibly in the Renaissance. Then we'll move into the Enlightenment. We actually have 2 days on the Enlightenment. And it's kind of a quirk that the closer you get to modern day, the finer the gradations become, right? Where you've got, even arguably things like the postmodern and the modern, and there we're talking about maybe a few decades each. Whereas, the medieval period's 1,000 years, right? So the closer you get to the present day, the finer the divisions become. It's possibly just sort of a quirk of recency. I mean, it could just be, closer to us, we see as more meaningful, further away, it's all thatched hut days. And then even further than that, it's just all toga times, right? So we'll see a couple of days here on the Enlightenment, then we'll move into the 19th century and you can see the gradations getting finer. And then the modern and postmodern, which our book lumps together because, our book, like any sort of tome like this is kind of inherently conservative in the sense of holding off judgment on comparatively recent stuff. These things that establish kind of canonical histories tend not to weigh in on even putting modern and postmodern together, right? It's not even going to necessarily make a stand separating someone like Ansel Dua from, someone like Toulmin, who is, he's a solid rhetor, but certainly not someone who the first person you'd think of in terms of postmodernism. Much more kind of a structuralist in certain ways. So that's where we're headed from here. And as much as possible, we'll try and do this as much as we can, as if it were still meeting in our room in Morton Hall. All right, so that's the gist of that. Any questions or anything right now? Okay. Let me just pull up my checklist here. Okay, yeah. So I think I've covered everything I wanted to cover. As we usually do, oh yeah, and we'll talk about the midterm after this. I did want to sort of pick up where we left off and continue thinking about how our definition of rhetoric has changed, right? So now, if nothing else, we've done the exam, right? So we've started to kind of articulate our thoughts about a whole sweep, kind of half of what we're looking at, right? Which is classical. It's interesting, right? That we have this focus on far away, right? Classical roots. And then it's a little bit of particularly when you move into the medieval and it's got, Augustine, and that's what you get for 1,000 years. And then an interest kind of in what's recent. So you're always, when you're doing these kinds of histories, talking about the origins and the current. The middle is often sort of what you're going through to get to one or the other. But the exam gave us a chance to think about, what rhetoric is. And now we're moving into a different period, right, where it's starting to do things like pick up threads of principally Christianity, but monotheistic Judeo-Christianity. But also we're starting to see some things like, at the other end, de Pizan, where we're starting to get movements into very modern ideals. So I did, as usual, just want to take a couple of minutes to jot down how our definition of rhetoric has changed now based on our recent stuff, maybe even recent events for that matter. How has our definition of rhetoric changed now? What do we think it is? So we'll take a couple minutes with that, and then we'll just share a few. Don't need to share my screen there. Just another minute with that, if we could, please.
do you see everything I put on my screen?
No, if you share your screen, then.
So I would have to do that. Okay, I've got the thing, I'm just trying to find it, but I have to go in my computer to do it.
No, we won't. There should be a little button on everybody's sort of bar at the bottom there that's green that says share. That'll enable you to share your screen. And in fact, Sam, I think you have your supplement today, so that's what you'll use. If there are any problems, we'll just, I've got your work here, so I can always share it too.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's go ahead. Let me unmute everybody here. All participants are unmuted. Doesn't look like it. Let's go ahead and chat for a little bit about our responses to this. So what are people's thoughts? How has your definition of rhetoric changed?
I added something about being able to reach a lot of people, because with Augustine and his sermons and stuff, he was big on like the 3 levels of like styles of speech, and also about something about writing being able to reach more people.
That's a good point, right? So one of the changes here now is, and we started to see this in the classical period, but the role of writing, right? This notion of mass distribution, and we can see that now in the contemporary sphere, particularly, right? Where this idea of, if everyone has the ability to mass communicate, what are the implications of that? Should everyone have the ability to mass communicate, right? So the role of writing changes things in a lot of ways. As you point out, mass communication. And then also, and this is something we see even its classical roots, writing gives us the ability to stabilize thought, right? They become objects of study in a way that orality resists, perhaps. Yeah, other thoughts?
I got rhetoric as a means to an end in order to persuade people to one's position. So I got that mostly from Christine de Pizan. Is that how you pronounce it?
Yeah, de Pizan, yeah.
Okay, and also Augustine, because Boethius's definition of rhetoric, I put down, please see Aristotle.
Well, say more about that.
What, about the Aristotle or the Pizan and Augustine?
Well, either, I suppose. I mean, are they both, you see them both as Aristotelians, or?
Both. Okay, now our textbook says Boethius. It was Aristotle.
Aristotelian? Boethius?
Aristotelian. So basically, and I addressed this in my response, it seemed like a SparkNotes version of Aristotle on rhetoric. But as far as de Pizan and Augustine uses rhetoric for persuading people to embrace Christ and the church. De Pizan uses it to persuade people that women have brains and we should be educated because, we're not all evil. We don't all eat apples.
Yeah, I mean, so again, we kind of return to this core issue of persuasion with both of them, right? Augustine, who arguably is, saying we can't distort truth, but we should be presenting it to best advantage. We are fighting for souls here, and he was in a very different, notion of what the church was at the time, right? I mean, they were competing, right? I mean, the perpetuation of the Christian church was by no means a guarantee at that point. I mean, he was, in fact, basically killed during a siege. And yeah, Boethius, he's always kind of an interesting character because it seems like he is, accounting for rhetoric. I mean, he's saying, this is sort of what it is, but he's not really seen as someone who advanced or had any interest in advancing it. He's just sort of like, yeah, okay, this is what people have said. But it's not really anything that he's treating it with sort of, with a distance. Yeah, other thoughts?
I put a bit about how, yet again, Augustine went back to that absolutist model of knowledge, and in that way really harkened back to the good man speaking well, because since he believed there was that sort of absolute truth you could latch onto, knowledge was not self-constructed like Cicero believed.
Yeah.
So yeah, even though I still don't buy into the good man speaking well part, it was definitely sort of core to him, I feel like.
Yeah, and if we use Quintilian's definition, rhetoric is a good man speaking well, and there's two components to that, right? You have to be a good person, and we can acknowledge person. You have to be a good person, and you have to speak well, which potentially just means, and I say just, it means eloquence, right? It's nice the way you're doing it, but it could also mean well as in doing well, right? Speaking well. And Quintilian is sort of a good citizen of the polis. It's probably at least possible that that's what he meant, right? That he's saying, you got to be a good person and you've got to be advancing good causes, right? And we didn't dip into it too much here, but I mean, if you think about who is the good man speaking well. Now for Quintilian, his closest answer is Cicero, right? He's like, well, Cicero is, even though he resisted the empire of which, I am now as Quintilian a citizen, he was a good person who had good principles, who, died fighting for what he felt was right. Now, if you think of a Christian tradition, who is the good man speaking well? It's right there, front and center. It's Christ, right? Christ is the good person. Christ is the original speaker of truth, right? And so he becomes, he's sort of Quintilian's answer. I mean, retroactively, that for the Christian tradition who picks up these threads from people like Quintilian, there is an answer. It's like, oh, okay, well, what they're talking about there is Christ. He's the perfect human, and he's leading us towards truth. Right? Answer found, right? So yeah, there's definitely sympathy between a certain rhetorical thread and what becomes, primary Western civilization.
Quintilian, between Quintilian and Augustine is, of course, that religious piece you're talking about, because he still was about contextualizing things and situations, and everybody gets to play. Whereas Augustine played with the whole Christ-like thing that you're talking about, because you can't have both. Either Jesus Christ was the God and everything he said is true, or else he's a good man speaking well. He can't be both.
Well, how do you mean? How can he not be
well,
both?
How Plato in the ideal thing that we can't achieve, but we try to achieve the transcendence. Well, that is a human trying to be godlike, but Augustine, religion tells us that godlike, there is a godlike being, or there is a God. But Quintilian, I don't think, ever suggested that his students would become godlike when they became good orators. It was more like the harm, be a good person is in its situational and it's contextual. You know what I'm saying? There's a separation between Augustine and Quintilian that way.
Well, and there's it may hinge on, what are we talking about when we say being good or doing good, right? I mean, for a lot of the classical rhetors, because they're, polytheistic, they're pre-Christian, the answer was the state, right? A good citizen, helping Rome. That's what being good is. Helping Athens. That's what being good is. I mean, even saw in our readings, how many overtures did you see to the gods in our classical work? Not a ton, right?
Well, in Phaedrus, didn't the Socrates character talk about gods a bit, but more kind of as a superstitious thing more than anything else?
Yeah, I mean, they pop up and we saw it in the encomium of Helen, right? Where Gorgias says, well, it's not Helen's fault if it was the will of the gods, right? It just becomes sort of this force of, if it was fate, if the gods said this was going to happen, she couldn't do anything about that.
But it was also treated like a throwaway line too. It wasn't like devoted paragraphs to it. It was kind of just a throwaway line.
It's not like he got into, so here's what we think Ares was thinking or anything like that. I mean, you don't see the same sort of devotion to God in the classical work, particularly in rhetoric history, that when we start to get into the Christian tradition, what goodness is tends to be much more attached to that, right? It's being ideally Christ-like, right? It's following the teachings of Christ. That's what your job is. And in fact, I mean, that kind of syncs up with that Platonic split, right? Plato points out or suggests this world that we're a part of is not the real world. This is a coarse reflection of an idealized world. And I mean, he even talks about in other works that we knew before our birth into this world, right? For Plato, all acts of knowledge are actually acts of recollection. We were once perfect. We're in this imperfect place. When we get closer to truth, we're actually remembering our idealized state. We're not finding anything new.
And if the people in control of these manuscripts are monks, why would they not just save the ones that support the church?
Exactly. I mean, to an extent, they did.
Exactly.
Right? I mean, that's why Plato lives.
Yeah.
Right? Because Plato, talking about an idealized world separate from this coarse world, coarse, as in coarse matter. Boy.
Didn't I read that a lot of the Quintilian stuff was saved by private collectors and that it was ignored by a monk for like a monastery for like 100 years or something?
Yeah, there are a lot of classical works that because they weren't seen as commensurate with contemporary Christian theology, they weren't necessarily destroyed, but they were neglected, right? I mean, so like a lot of these works, they either found in a monastery centuries later, it was just like, that was in the back room. I mean, you hear about this now still in like Vatican archives.
Yeah. This
kind of stuff still goes on in secular ways as well. I mean, every now and then they'll find a new novel by, someone who's been dead a few hundred years that was just somewhere, it was like, it was in somebody's, as you say, private collection and no one was looking for it. So yeah, I mean, again, it's sort of a history written by the winners thing.
Yes.
The Christian tradition came to dominate Western civilization. So what we know of the classical world, a lot of it came filtered through that. I mean, they were also doing things like the translations of this stuff.
Yeah.
Right? And if you think translation isn't an act of rewriting, I don't know what to tell you.
Heresy of the paraphrase or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, it's unavoidable when you're trying to do something like translation that you have to make decisions. You have to make rhetorical decisions, and those are inherently ethically bound. So not only, what are we even bothering to preserve, but how are we preserving it? In what format? It's why, and I think our introduction to the medieval period talked about this a bit. Sometimes we recovered things through sources like the Middle East, right? Later, Muslim scholars had things like full translations of Cicero or full translations of Quintilian or other classical figures that the Western world, was in no shape to do because it was the Dark Ages, or didn't bother because it was pagan, right? Yeah. All of this stuff is really fascinating, but it does, it underscores, that history is such a construction. I mean, we are here learning the mainline history, but that is unavoidably a subjective pursuit, Anywho, other thoughts that people had about rhetoric and maybe how it's changed in light of what we read or other stuff?
Just the contextual and situational part of it, that every piece of it is contextual and situational.
But what do you mean by that? I mean, I agree, but
one speech given in one situation could at least do no harm, but the same speech in a different situation, in a different context, could do great harm. Like a pep talk in the middle of a pandemic could get people killed. But a pep talk at a rally makes everybody happy, does no harm. You know?
Yeah.
Situational, contextual.
Yeah. And that manifests in a lot of ways. I mean, as you point out, certainly in contemporary messages right now, I mean, you know, I teach science writing, and I mean, it's such a, we're just seeing it unfold right now. I mean, the whole class now is basically just look, you know. But yeah, I mean, it also manifests in things like language choice, right? I mean, even diction things. Yeah. This often comes up. It's like, well, how come this group can say this word, but my group can't say that word? Yeah. Because the context is so radically different, right? The same words out of someone else's mouth are different words, yes. Right? Yeah. And we can see the roots of this even classically. This isn't new info. This isn't postmodern. It's always been there.
Same as it ever was. I keep saying that. Same as it ever was. Same as it ever was.
Well, who was it? I think someone in here mentioned that. Was it Mark Twain who said, you know, history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes, right? You keep seeing the same rhyming stuff crop up again. I mean, this was in the Dissoi Logoi, where they're saying, you know, they say it's holy here. They say it's unholy there. Nudity is okay here. These aren't postmodern things. These are, you know, when we started having civilization in the Western world things.
But I used to think that it repeated, you know how they say history repeats itself if you don't learn history? Well, I think history repeats itself because these demagogues discovered that it works. Look, it worked for them. Let's do that. And it works again. I just think humans aren't that complex. I think A plus B equals C. And just this generation is getting the same stuff that worked for the last generation and the generation prior to that. It's just we work in a particular way, and if you don't know what to look for, and honestly, how many people are going to be in a rhetoric class and study to see how the last generation was fooled by demagoguery? You know, it's a very specialized study. You know, it's like,
you know, or if that even matters, we might see. There are people who do critique who would say, you know, awareness of something may not be enough anyway. I mean,
no, because you have to have a majority that agree that it's a bad thing. How many people know that lies are being told, but they don't care? So what? You know, it's just, I don't know. It's like, it's good enough that we know, right? I guess.
Well, and it returns us potentially to someone like Aristotle, right? Where awareness of the available means of persuasion, that doesn't necessarily mean the ability to counter them, right? Yeah. The ability to undo what you see as deleterious impacts by...
Well, Cicero died trying to do that.
Yeah, I mean, because like a lot of times when I teach these courses, sometimes students will... like in the argument class, students will say, what I really want to know is how to shut up someone who's doing an argument that is wrong. It's like, well, I don't know if I can teach you that. I don't know if there's a way to do that.
Or if you should.
Yeah, I mean, usually the suggestion is it's probably better just not to engage in that way. You don't want to cut off people completely, but arguments tend to end up with two losers. Anyway.
But arguments are also the only way that you can discover new information, whether it be arguing with yourself or with someone else with at least an equivalent amount of information. I mean, argument is dialectic, right? But take away the emotional part of it and it becomes a tool for good.
Well, who is Sam, are you doing invitational rhetoric?
Yes.
Well, so we might see even in your supplement, right? That's what you're doing your supplement over?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Well, what do you think about that? Is argument the only way to learn or get knowledge, or?
According to invitational rhetoric, no, because they kind of want to get away from like rhetoric as a purpose to just persuade people to change their mind, but think of it more in terms of just offering an opinion and just listening to all sides of things. So it's less like aggressive in that way. So there are other ways to approach it, definitely, according to invitational rhetoric. And then, of course,
is that just a different way of, is that just a different label, though? Instead of calling it argument, you're calling it something else? Because it sounded like you just described what argument is. I mean, argument for information, asking questions and finding holes, playing devil's advocate. I mean, you can do that without being aggressive, and you can do it without it being an argument. It's a way of getting to information that you otherwise, you know, wouldn't get at. Is it just a different title for the same thing?
the way they kind of present it is that you go in with a different purpose. So you're not overtly going in thinking like, I'm going to change this person's mind. You're just trying to clearly articulate kind of how you feel about the situation and the information that you have, and kind of sharing that and listening to the other side as well.
Do they get to ask you questions?
You can. So it's more like a conversational type of thing.
You know, and a lot of this actually comes out of, and you may talk about this, so I don't want to step on your toes, but some of these notions of rhetoric doesn't have to be a fight comes out of things like feminist critique, that that assumption that this is a fight is bound up with larger cultural notions of everything is a war, right?
Winning, losing, yeah.
I thought everything was a war. And
that?
argument was a way to make my enemies into submission.
Well, there's a book. Has anyone read the book Metaphors We Live By?
No. Who wrote it?
I think Lakoff, George Lakoff. Let me hold on real quick here. Let's see here. I have it. Do I have it here? No, it's probably at work, which I can't go to anymore.
Damn, Sam, you're smart.
Yeah, it's Lakoff and Johnson. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. This is what it looks like. And so it actually deals with kind of precisely this issue where it...
Ooh, $5.19.
Oh yeah, you can get this cheaply now. It deals with this idea of the sort of the paradigmatic underpinnings of culture. And so it looks at things like, you know, our judicial system is explicitly considered to be adversarial, right? You have an offensive component, you have a defensive component. The one that is truest or true wins, right?
So me.
But he points out, you know, there's no reason at all the legal system would have to proceed that way. And there are things like grand juries. Anyone ever been on a grand jury? So like a grand jury is, it's when you get a bunch of people together and they essentially are fact finders. What they're trying to do usually is do something like find out, is there enough information here for this to move to something else, like another case or something like that. So it isn't prosecution and defense, it's fact finding. It's a bunch of people trying to figure out what happened here. And so there's no necessary inherent reason that it has to be predicated on an adversarial system. That was an invention. It's an old invention, but it's an invention. Things could have been other.
Wasn't it because they had to entertain the masses? I mean, it was like an entertainment thing. You had, I'm talking about, who talked about that? Was it Cicero that was talking about going into court, and you had to assume that the audience wasn't as smart as you, and therefore you had to persuade them with pathos. And then he detailed exactly how you should do it, when you should be like aggressive and when you should not be aggressive.
Well, I mean, potentially, but I mean, imagine a legal system that's not court-based. You're not going in front of an audience to do anything. You're, you know, in this example, get a bunch of people together and try and figure out what happened here. Was this a murder? And come to some kind of consensus about that, right? So this book, and I mean, there are a lot of others, this is just a notable one, looks at that kind of, these are, you know, metaphorical underpinnings, right? That argument is predicated on a fight, is war. justice is a fight, right? But it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. And then also feminist critiques have leveled those same kind of charges, that this isn't inherent. This is an outgrowth of patriarchal traditions, right? Everything doesn't have to be a fight, right? Things can function in other ways. And in fact, we can probably find examples of them. They just tend to be examples that are quashed for a lot of reasons, right? The potentially the biggest lie that's possible is this is just how things are. The paradigm is natural. Probably that's not the case. The paradigm is probably subjective. It could be otherwise.
False consciousness.
Anywho, so and yeah, we'll segue into Sam, your supplement here in a little bit, and you can probably pick that up and tell us more about notions of rhetoric that aren't necessarily adversarial, maybe not predicated on things like persuasion. I've got an idea, I need to bring someone to it, but maybe different distributed collaborative notions of that. Before we get to that, just really quickly, I did want to point out, yeah, the midterm. So everyone's midterm should be returned. Everybody did well, which is great. It's not surprising. I assumed everyone would do well, and everyone did.
Except for Tess.
What's that?
Except for Tess. I didn't think she would do well, but I guess she passed.
A miracle.
No, everybody did great. No. And, as we talked about, tests are a weird situation, right? I mean, there is a weirdness to tests, but particularly for those of us who haven't yet taken the MA exam, it's a necessary weirdness because it's coming, right? And you don't want to spend your entire, graduate academic career doing papers, and then all of a sudden they say, now take a test, right? It is weird. And it's one of sort of the last big tests. If you go on to your PhD, it's they have them there too. Mine, you do written and oral, and then you have to do your thesis, your dissertation defense, and so these things are there. Just a couple of notes about that. So speaking to sort of the weirdness of testing situations, one thing is make sure you answer the question, which seems obvious, but is not, right? So look at the components of the question. And if it has two components or something, look at these people and articulate what they said about this. Make sure you answer all those components. And what I usually say is a good idea in these kind of situations is do that in the intro. Think of your reader. If this is a rhetoric class, think of your reader. In your introduction, set up, here's the answer to your question that you just asked, right? Here are the three people. This is the one that's, like in our teaching question, this is the one that's most like a modern pedagogy. And here are the three reasons why, right? Just give your reader the checklist, right? Boom, boom, boom. They've answered the question. Then what you spend the rest of your paragraphs doing is explicating that, right? Now I'm going to provide detail. So answer the question, all parts. And I really encourage you to do it right at the beginning. As I mentioned, this is another reason why it's not always great to write from the start, write from the middle. So that way, when you're finishing up and you can write your intro, you have that answer, right? Here's what they say, boop, boop, boop. And that's why this guy is the most modern, because you've already written that. So I know time is a crunch in an exam situation, but you do want to make sure you answer the question concretely. I mean, even use the language of the question prompt if you can, and do it in the intro. That way, there's no debate about whether or not you answered the question. We can debate whether you fully answered it, but you answered it, right? That part is already secured.
I feel like I spent a quarter of the whole test trying to track down the quotes I had in my head.
Yeah.
Finally, I just went to your notes, and I said Tirrell notes. Everything else was from the book, but I didn't write that down. So.
Well, and so that's always kind of an issue, because the second part of this is, so what do I spend the other paragraph's doing, and that's evidence, right? So that's providing detail about what I said here. And yeah, the kind of prime example of that is primary material, right? Quotes, synthesis of primary material. And do lean toward using primary material, so the stuff from the authors, rather than secondary commentary. I know for our situation, it's weird. So there were a lot of cases where it's like, well, here's what Bizel and Herzberg says, right? Now, when we get to like the MA exam, you do want to pull from primary sources because they want you to be the secondary commenter, right? It's your job now to stitch together that primary material. You're Bizel and Herzberg, right?
Yeah, but even if you're quoting Cicero, you're still citing Bizel, right?
Well, not if it's his work. No, then you are citing him.
Then you have to go to the bibliography of Bizel and find that. You have to find, because
so technically
we could only bring in the book in whatever journal articles we had.
No, so what you would do, I mean, in these situations, you're not going to have to prepare a bibliography, but if you did, that would be listed under Cicero, right? If you were to do an MLA citation, it wouldn't be Bizel and Herzberg. It would be Cicero, De Oratori. It would appear in the rhetorical tradition, editors, Bizel and Herzberg, pages, blah, 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 right? So you're still citing Cicero, right? It's just it happens to appear in this edited collection. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but for an exam, I would have to find, no?
No, I mean, for an exam, you're not going to have to write a bibliography.
Well, the exam, I cited everything out of Bizel and Herzberg or whatever.
Which is fine, but keep in mind, there are multiple authors within this text.
Yeah.
Right? But you'd be citing Cicero says this in De Oratori, right?
Yeah.
Quintilian says this.
But the page number I took out of the book.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Oh, that's okay.
Oh, yes. Yeah. In fact, you wouldn't want to say you're citing, you want to make clear that you are citing the version that appears in this text, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, you won't have to write up a bibliography. But if you did, the entries would be Cicero, Quintilian, right? It would just appear in Bizel and Herzberg. Now, if you were using their language, right? Here's what they say about them.
Yeah, that would be them.
You're going to have to, and ultimately what you'd end up doing is cross-referencing, where when you have multiple sources coming out of the same collection, you do in MLA what's called cross-referencing, where you essentially reference it once, and then in the other places, you more or less put what's new, and then you say C and the other source. But you won't have to do this in an exam. This is all stuff that you don't have to worry about for a testing situation.
Good.
The takeaway, though, is when you're making your claims about, here's what Quintilian thought, or here's what Aristotle said, go to their primary texts, right? Cut out the mediating layer of Bizel and Herzberg for a testing situation, because we want to see you engage with primary ideas. It's stronger evidence.
Yeah.
Because really, that's what the testing situation is, right? I mean, it's this weird obstacle course. What they want you to do is demonstrate that you've engaged with these texts and you can think in critical ways about them. That's what they want, right? As someone who's, graded the MA exam many times, more times than I probably should have, that's what they want to see. So let's see. Yeah, that's the gist of it. I mean, tests are weird, but as a test-taking strategy, those are a couple of bullet points that I think are really useful for folks. One, make sure to answer the question, right? All parts of it. Use the language of the prompt if you can. Do that in the intro, right? You can't provide a lot of detail, but you can provide an overview answer in the introduction. And really, I mean, that's what an introduction is. And then use the rest of the paragraphs to provide evidence for what you just claimed in the introduction, using primary material where you can. Any questions about that? Yeah, I mean, again, everyone did very well. It's just, exams are strange. And I mean, having now, I've probably taken my last exam. but I still, evaluate them a fair amount. And so you get sort of a different insight into what do they actually want with this. It's a rhetorical situation. Okay, why don't we slide over to Sam? Why don't you do your supplement for us?
Okay.
Can you see the share button on your...
Yes.
Okay.
Go Sam. Go Sam.
Does everybody see that?
Yes, how did that happen?
There's a green button on your window that says share, and then it lets you pick what you want to share. And everybody can do that.
Holy shit.
Okay, so like I talked about before, I'm presenting on invitational rhetoric, and those of us that are in Dr. Peel's class this semester, we looked at a little bit of this. So one of the articles that I'm going to talk about is maybe familiar. So the first one is Beyond Persuasion, a proposal for an invitational rhetoric by Foss and Griffin. And they wanted to have invitational or develop something like invitational rhetoric so that they can look beyond what they call the patriarchal bias that comes with much of the tradition of rhetoric. And it's also shaped by feminist practices. And one of the major quotes is that embedded in efforts to change others is a desire for control and domination, for the act of changing another establishes the power of the change agent over that other. So trying to get away from a lot of that that's present in traditional rhetoric is kind of why they developed this. And the feminist principles that they draw from are equality, eminent value, and self-determination. And then part of the way they define invitational rhetoric is that it constitutes an invitation to the audience to enter the rhetor's world and to see it as the rhetor does. In presenting a particular perspective, the invitational rhetor does not judge or denigrate others' perspectives, but is open to and tries to appreciate and validate those perspectives. So it's not just about, here I am and here are all of my opinions, now I need you to feel this way, but it's also about listening to the other person and taking into consideration those counter arguments, probably in a way that might not be as present in traditional rhetoric. And the goal of invitational rhetoric is not to change someone's opinion, but to offer different perspectives. And then some of the implications of that are to challenge persuasion is the goal of rhetoric, and to work towards cooperative and non-adversarial and ethical communication, and to have a greater heuristic and inventive function of rhetoric. They have some others that they listed, but these were three of the ones that I really picked out.
Challenges persuasion is the goal of rhetoric?
Yeah, so they don't want to have persuasion as kind of the main goal. That the main goal is, again, to offer perspectives and not just persuade you to feel that one way. It's just offering, here's a different way you might look at this thing. And then a little bit later, Griffin wrote with some other people, Bone and Schultz, beyond traditional conceptualizations of rhetoric, invitational rhetoric, and a move towards civility. And this is kind of an updated version of invitational rhetoric, and they also respond to some of the critiques that they'd had after that first article. And so some of the critiques, there are quite a few, but here are some of them that they go through, because it's a lot and I wouldn't have time to like go through this entire article. But some critics have said things like the association between persuasion and violence is unacceptable, because people were thinking that they were just saying that persuasion was violent at all times, and that's not kind of what they were trying to say. And people said that Foss and Griffin unrealistically advocate that invitational rhetoric is useful in every situation, when that's not true if you're like trying to talk to someone who obviously believes like these really like for example, like morally terrible things, like invitational rhetoric is maybe not the best way to approach that, and they acknowledge that. Also, people think that the theory is gender specific or grounded in essentialist principles, that it lacks a notion of agency, or that it's actually just persuasion in disguise. And I talked about, I think, 2 of the responses to the critiques. Invitational rhetoric is appropriate in every interaction. And they said their response to that was that it's not the only tool, but it is an option that you have. And then a quote to kind of back that up is that the historical record is rich with examples of successful communication in extreme situations that do not meet the criteria for persuasive communication. Witnessing is one such example, as are nonviolent acts of civil disobedience, protests, and marches, and the sit-ins of the 60s. So they give examples of what this would look like in practice, so that you can kind of see, here are some situations where that would work and be useful. And also just to give you an idea of what that would look like, because it might be hard to kind of...
Would letters from the Birmingham jail be considered invitational rhetoric?
Maybe. I feel like you could probably argue that.
Could you argue it wasn't also?
Yeah, probably. And the other critique that I looked at was that, or wanted to talk about, was invitational rhetoric is persuasion in disguise. And people were saying that even the offering of a perspective is persuasive. But their kind of counter to that is that you can kind of interpret it as speaking with the intent to be heard and understood. And it's part of a multi-log instead of just like a dialogue back and forth. You're offering more than 1 or even 2 perspectives in this situation. And it raises questions about the language we use, our goals as communicators, and the options available to us, and the way we position and view those with whom we communicate. So it's about not putting down maybe the other person's viewpoints completely and saying, you know, I might not agree with this part of what you're saying, but I can maybe agree with some of these things, and trying to open up a dialogue in that way. And that's it.
Amazing job. Fantastic.
Thank you.
Yeah. That was really invigorating.
No. That's very situational and contextual.
Yeah.
I have no idea what's going on. Because everything's frozen.
He's muted. He was talking and nothing came out.
Let me unmute everybody. Sorry, there you go. So has anyone ever heard of Rogerian rhetoric by any chance?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
In our teaching English comp class.
503.
Yeah. So say more about that, Britton. What is it?
I am so sorry. We talked about this not that long ago, but I honestly have forgotten with everything going on. I probably have it in my notes, which I have here, but it might take me a minute. Does anybody else know off the top of their head? Oh, I guess Google.
Yeah.
So Rogerian rhetoric, I was just pointing over to my screen here. It's a
conflict.
Yes, I mean, it's a codified system.
Oh no, Brent's being maliciously attacked by a vicious.
Oop. Sorry. I guess someone's cutting in and out. But it's a system.
Yeah, I'm gone. I'm not in anymore.
No, let me just check. Can other folks hear me?
I can hear you. I just can't see anything. Oh, there we go.
I found it.
Okay, what do you got?
Okay, I have it in my notes. It's Carl Rogers, Rogerian argument. See the expressed idea from the other person's point of view to see how they feel and achieve their frame of reference. A back and forth like that illustrated in Dissoy Logoi. That's what I wrote down.
Yeah. Have other people heard of it before?
Yeah.
Well, my notes were similar, but we talked about this in 503, and the format that you typically use, I guess, in writing it would be you present view A, and then you present view B, and you kind of just leave it open for the you leave it open for the for your reader to kind of, you try not to sway them, you just give them the options. And it's I wrote down here, I hear you, basically just trying to hear each side.
That would be transfer knowledge.
So when you hear a statement like, I hear you, what, if any, associations, what do you think of if someone says something like that? I hear you.
Couples therapy.
Yes. Yeah, Rogerian rhetoric has got a foothold in conflict mediation and therapy. The sort of organizing principle is you can only advance a point once you have recapitulated the other party's point to their satisfaction. Mm-hmm. So one person would say, I feel like you don't, in couples therapy, I feel like you don't help me around the house. And so the other person would have to say,
you never help me around the house.
Which you'd have to say, what I hear you saying is that I don't assist you, that you're the only one who is doing house chores, and I'm not there to help you, right? Is that a fair statement of what you said? And once the person has agreed, you can then move on and say, my perspective is that, you have to do that while I do this, or whatever point you want to make here. But so conflict mediation, including therapy, is where Rogerian rhetoric has kind of made its bones. But it's potentially linked to this kind of thing where we're not necessarily trying to find the winner, right? Particularly not in something like couples therapy, where you usually don't want to try and find, well, you're obviously right and you're obviously wrong. It's usually a dangerous proposition.
But it is based on conflict resolution. So there is the assumption that conflict exists in Rogerian interaction is mediating that.
But it's resolving it. Right?
But it's conflict resolution. So the assumption is there is a conflict, which is kind of different from what she's talking about. She's invitational rhetoric, right? Is just the presentation of information, and you just take it or you don't take it. You can ask questions, but we're not arguing about it. Right?
Potentially it seeks to obviate conflict, right? Before it begins, by not lapsing into potentially binary structures of self and other, right and wrong. Yeah, Britton.
It's like the compliment sandwich, if anybody's heard of that. So you have like the positive and then the negative and then another positive. So if you're having argumentation like this, you want to say, I understand you, I'm listening to you. This is how I view it, but your opinion is still valid. Your side is still valid. So kind of cushioning it so they feel valued, but then also value you as well, and keep conflict away in that manner.
As soon as I do it, my kids roll their eyes and walk away. I hear what you're saying, but
you gotta, at this point, I feel like it's so ingrained in society, you have to take away its structural design and put it in a new kind of way of presenting it. Otherwise, they'll catch it in an instant.
Well, that's what we were just talking about, right? We were talking about same as it ever was. It's like humans just do the same thing over and over again. All we do is rebrand it.
Well, I was going to say too, we actually briefly touched on Rogerian rhetoric in the 201 class I teach, which it was interesting that my mentor decided to include it. But when we discussed it, what I mainly got out of it was the potential for a delayed thesis by using the Rogerian model, which we also talked about in 503, because the 4 parts in the text that she gave the students were introduction, context, writer's position, and benefits to opponent. So you definitely have to get the groundwork of understanding the other party out of the way and really probing the issue before you can actually get to your claim.
Yeah, it's interesting because in a model like conflict resolution, the goal is potentially to alleviate the conflict, right? So the process alleviates the conflict. But what would invitational rhetoric look like in a political structure where ultimately we do have to maybe we do, maybe we don't, but maybe we do have to decide, hey, are we going to give people money for the coronavirus thing? Ultimately, it seems like maybe you have to make a choice And so would a structure like invitational rhetoric function in those kind of political situations? Could you have a deliberative rhetoric that's invitational? What do you think, Sam?
I think that maybe what that would look like would be something closer to making sure that you find some kind of thing that, well, everyone's not going to be satisfied at the end of any decision that you make, but coming up with maybe an answer that incorporates parts of what other people are arguing, so that it's more like not just take this one side or take this other side. There's something like somewhere in the middle that maybe leans, it might lean a little bit more one side or the other, but maybe not just saying like this one thing or this one thing. It might be like some kind of combination type of thing would maybe be how that would work.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. I mean, you know, we tend to idealize that's how politics should work, is compromise, right? We can see an adversarial system like law, right? Like forensic rhetoric, and say, well, the person's either going to go to jail or not, right? It's not like they're going to half go to jail. You know, they might go to jail for part of the time or something, or house arrest, but there's not really a compromise exactly in the same way as, well, in this situation, we want a coronavirus recovery package, and we're going to try and incorporate as much as we can, right? So we need something to deal with, you know, debt. We need something to just get cash in people's hands. We need something so that all business doesn't collapse, right? You know, maybe that's, you know, maybe an idealized invitational would be political compromise. Yeah, I don't know. And you did point out maybe all situations, and this has come up before, maybe all situations don't lend themselves to invitational rhetoric. You pointed out something like moral issues, right? We talked about this, I think, very briefly in class. If someone's, you know, their goal is genocide, and that does happen throughout history, and the opposing argument is no genocide, the compromise isn't some genocide, right? It's got to be, well, no. So there are probably situations where it's like, this isn't a case where we entertain your perspective. We can listen, but we can't incorporate it because it's antithetical to the contributions of everything else, possibly. This comes up. Sorry, go ahead.
There's been a lot of talk about the social contract lately, mostly because every ism is being exacerbated. Everything. It's the priority of particular demographics. Like the only people that get tests are the rich and the famous, right? I mean, that's kind of like almost a trope now. I just don't see how you can change human nature. You're people, I mean, we've already been complaining about the tribalism. It's just going to get worse when lives are at stake. And what you were talking about, politicians getting together and mediating about what should happen. And they're talking about cutting off food stamps for people, but bailing out, you know, cruise ships that aren't even like paying taxes to the United States. I mean, how do you mediate something like that? You know, you can't.
Potentially something the feminist critique raises is, but is that human nature or is that human practice, right?
Well, after like 25, 30 centuries later, people keep doing the same thing. I mean, at what point do you not say, okay, I think I have enough source material to say, yeah, it's kind of like what humans do.
Well, let's ask, what is foundational to the human? What is human nature?
It's not the social contract. It's not like we should care. You know, that almost is like a false consciousness. It's like it was a good idea, but it's just not practiced beyond individuals. I mean, sometimes you have people that you know, get power and are able to do that. I mean, the New Deal helped generations of people, and yet he was a flaming racist. You know, it's like
well, but I mean, beyond specific permutations, what is something that is baseline human? What can you say that is essential?
We live and then we die. That's about all we have in common.
Death, potentially. Other things die, but I mean, that is a feature possibly.
We're aware of our mortality.
Consciousness, right? I mean, that's the cogito argument.
Human connection.
What do you mean?
I mean, you can't really exist without coming in contact with others. And by coming in contact with others, there often is conflict with others. So there has to be some form of a consensus as a group where I acknowledge other people exist. I need to be able to live within a society where other people exist.
There is that statement that no person is an island. Could you be a human without other humans?
I think you could in a sense, but I think the idea of what being a human is that we've constructed today changes in a large sense. Like, there are actual studies out there, I don't know a lot about them, so my apologies, but of people who have not had other human interactions, who have had to live in the wild, and tests of things that have been done to some extent, where it just has changed what it means to be human. So I think if you're looking at what is it to be this body, to be a human being versus the concept of human that we've created through time. Does that make sense?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay.
Well, it's a real question. I mean, it seems like a navel-gazing question, but it's a real question of what, if anything, is essentially human. Because if you could find a bedrock, you could build from it, right? I mean, we talked about the cogito argument before, because if Descartes is right, I think, therefore I am something. I am whatever it is. I am right. Then potentially you can build outward from that. But otherwise, I mean, when there are claims about, well, this is just human nature, or this is just how things are, it's maybe a good practice to have some skepticism of that, right? I mean, if nothing else, this form of critique comes from the notion of, well, this is just how men and women are. It's just how they are. You're fighting against something that is natural and inherent.
No, I wouldn't suggest that at all. I just think that human beings are, okay, we all have our privileges. Not one of us is capable of shedding our privileges. All we have under our control is to acknowledge we have our privileges. That's the only control we have over them, right? Societal, cultural structures prevent us from shedding our privileges. You know what I'm saying? So I'm not suggesting it's human nature to have those privileges. I'm just saying that it is in our nature to say, yeah, this is what it is. And we have, if we're lucky, 90 years, and we're just like, yeah, it's just our turn to be dealing with this crap, and maybe we'll make some progress that will kind of realize the social contract. Maybe we won't. Maybe we'll live through a genocide like World War II or Rwanda, or maybe we'll have control. Maybe we won't have control, but if we get 90 years and we represent or we don't, it's like, I don't know. It's just, I don't think we have natures. I think we have ISAs, ideological state apparatuses, and repressive state apparatuses, and they tell us what we got to do if you don't want to get in trouble, and we do it. And they protect us, so we do it.
Sure. Well, and this will be something that, looking quite a bit forward, we'll revisit, particularly in the postmodern period, this notion of, is there an essential anything? Is there an essential humanity? Is there even an essential self? And that's come up with us before, right? Even in something like the classical interest in natural talent. Do people have certain natural abilities, different natural abilities, or not, right? Are there some things we can say are natural? Do you feel, and you don't have to answer this because it's probably unanswerable, but do you feel you have a core self? And there are maybe different manifestations of that, right? I perhaps act differently with different groups of people, of course I do, but there is a core whomever I am at base. Or is it masks all the way down, right? You pull back a mask, there's just more masks. There is no essential core Jeremy or whatever. It's just a series of performances. These will be discussions that'll animate particularly the postmodern period.
The core that you're talking about, personally, I think it's more, what do you fear the most? And that is your core. It's like, if you're going to be, like, do you know how they have the saying about a hero is just someone who just doesn't run away 5 seconds longer than the next guy? That's what a hero is. Well, a hero is the person that saves the child in front of the bus because it is more intolerable to not save the child than it is to die. And does that make that person a hero? Or does that just mean that their fear of being a kind of person that would allow a child to get hit by a bus without trying to save them is more of their priority? You know what I'm saying? And who's to say which is more important? Society and culture decides. So if you have a core, it's probably more about what you fear than anything else. And that, I guess, could be traced back to chemicals, right? That could be nature.
Or then it could be argued that it's human nature, it's in our nature to protect our offspring so that our species survives.
You mean you wouldn't step in front of a bus for a neighbor's kid?
I've never been in that situation, so I don't know. But
I think you would. I think it's, you see someone, you want to save it or not. You know what I mean? It's not like, oh, my kid. I'm going to save anybody's kid, you know?
I'm just saying, like, I mean, but even still, like, if you see, like, a lot of laws, the punishment is so much worse if it's done to a child. And it's always seen as more horrifying if something ill is done towards a child because it's innocent. And that is, you know, no matter whose child it actually is, they're the next generation. They're going to keep our species alive. So, I mean, could you argue that it would be an inherent, like, a human nature to want to save that, not necessarily a fear?
There are too many examples of people having no problem allowing other people to die to save themselves.
But I mean, it's just, you could argue. I think you could make an argument for either way.
Yeah, and we'll presumably we probably won't resolve this, but we'll see different answers for this supposition. You know, we even saw in the classical period notions of, well, yes, Plato says there is an essential humanity. We just have imperfect encounters with it, but there is something there. We'll see in the Christian tradition, well, yes, I mean, there is an essential humanity. It comes from the divine. Again, this world isn't perfectly attuned to it, but it's there nonetheless. We'll see as we move forward into things like the Renaissance, we'll see maybe things like, well, reason is transcendent, right? We humans reason, and that's something that is beyond us. Then we'll see things as we move into the Enlightenment, you know, biological arguments, right? This is just the result of the brain and evolution. We're just sort of billiard balls that are bouncing around based on biological factors. But it's not clear if there's ever really a answer to this, in part because, you know, even if you had one, you'd have to convince everybody of it. There'd have to be consensus about it, right? I mean, it's back to Gorgias with, even if there were an answer here, you couldn't convince everybody. And even if you could, you couldn't be certain that they had the same idea in their head. And even if they did, it wouldn't matter. So we'll see variable answers to this kind of question. What is the hook from which our constructions of language follow, right? We're headed into our break here. I did want to have a break since this is still 3 hours. So let's go ahead and take 10 minutes or so. So, around 5 past.
Quick question.
Yeah, Heather.
Okay, are we going to talk about the abstract when we get back?
Yes.
Great. I got questions.
Okay. All right.
All right.
So I'll see folks then. 10 minutes. Excuse me. Let's see here. Let's see. Oh yeah, denim. We can segue there. me see, where's okay, so I got supplement and responses. I think that's it for today. Oh, man, I need 4 hours to do this, man.
Heather,
Yeah.
how you doing with the kids?
Great.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's been like, hey, can we have a sleepover? No. Hey, can we have a sleepover? Maybe. So.
Oh, geez. It'll get better, I promise.
And now, I think somebody said something about they're not going to be in school until May.
Yep, May 15, but I think we all saw that coming.
Yeah. Well, my sister told me that, and I really think, because she said that the end of school is like only 13 days later. So I really don't think that they would put them back in school for just 13 days.
No, I think Charlie's done her last day of kindergarten.
Yeah. Sad panda.
That's sad. My daughter's supposed to graduate 5th grade. Well, my oldest is.
We were supposed to graduate too, but
yeah, that's where that one class of 2020 rubber. No, you didn't see them. I put them away, but I got rubber band bracelets saying class of 2020.
Aww.
I had 12 of them, but I gave her one because I forgot she was class of 2022. So yeah, I got 11 though. Just gonna give them out. Swear I don't have a virus, so they're not contaminated.
What are you eating, Allison?
My brother, he made, I don't know exactly what it's called, but it's just fried bread. And he made it. Yeah, it's pretty good.
I like your room.
It's practically tasteless. Thank you.
Oh.
Thank you. It's
I love the lava lamps. I'm always a big fan of lava lamps, and that furniture's beautiful.
Thanks. The chest is my dad's, the armoire is my mother's, and then the red lamp was my dad's. He had it, and when we were kids, I always loved it. So when I had my own space, he gave it to me. And then I think it was for my 14th or 15th birthday, he got me the blue lamp. Because my favorite color is blue, in case you didn't know.
Nice. I used to have a lava lamp. Yeah, I used to have a lava lamp too, but there was a major robbery a few years back. But I do have a disco ball. One day I will put it up.
You should. I bet you know what? You have plenty of time.
Putting it in the bathroom.
Okay.
Look at my dog.
Your dog is so cute, by the way.
I know. I love her.
I had my nephew in here and he was waving, like just at the screen, like saying hi. And I'm like, there's nobody here, honey. He's just hi.
Yeah, my son's way too upset because he's not spending the night at Mima's house. That otherwise he would be making an appearance and trying to make sure that everybody knew he was here.
Okay, why don't we go ahead and
my oldest daughter doesn't give a damn.
What's that? Really? Okay, so let's go ahead and move forward. Let me share my screen with you here. So we did want to go ahead and take a look at the abstract, the paper, and the presentation. So that's what will consume the remainder of the semester. If we look at those in parts here, so we've seen this briefly before, but the abstract, of course, we've turned to that when we've been looking at the CFP lists. Hopefully we'll have a chance to do that again tonight, but we'll see if we can fit it in. So the abstract, as it says, students will engage critically with the field of rhetoric by producing and presenting a scholarly essay in response to a disciplinary call for papers. So one of the reasons why I've been looking at all those CFPs is to identify options, right? We are going to be targeting your work to a particular CFP. Now, you do not have to submit your work to it. It's just, it gives us a context in which to work, right? So if I'm looking at this publication or this conference, I know this is what it's about. So I'm going to craft my work accordingly. As it says, the first step in this endeavor is to survey the academic landscape by reviewing CFPs and identifying a conference or journal call that would be appropriate for their work. And, most of the CFP lists we're looking at will be things like conferences and special issues. But you certainly also can target journals otherwise. So if you have an interest in a particular area, you can just look up the journals in that area and potentially shape your work in that direction as well. The goal here really is just to find a specific context, right? So a specific journal, a specific conference, you just want to be creating your work to suit something so it's not just in a vacuum. Are there any questions?
Okay, I got a question.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, so my CFP that well, actually I shouldn't say thinking of doing because I've read like 2 books towards it, so I don't want to waste my time. But anyways, there's no page requirement for the CFP because it's for an edited collection.
Okay.
So what would you say my page requirement if we don't have like a specific page requirement for the CFPs? Because what they're asking for is a rough draft of what you're working with.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so if it doesn't stipulate a word count for the CFP, we can probably take a look at it. In that case, we could probably do something like 300-ish words. We want to work with, the crux of an abstract is distilling your thing into a short format. So if it doesn't stipulate, we can find, a page or something like that. The actual word count isn't that big of a deal. That's one reason why it's not stipulated here, because usually in CFPs, they will ask for it. But if they don't, we can just identify one that's feasible. I'm not too hung up about word counts. It's the practice of digesting your work into a short format.
Okay, so we're writing an essay in response to a CFP request, and then we're doing an abstract on it. So there are going to be two pieces of product here, two texts.
Technically, there's three. There's the abstract, the paper, and then the presentation.
So the abstract is on the paper, and the presentation is also on the paper.
They're all, yes, addressing the same thing. Yes, that's one way to think of it, is you write a paper and then, yeah, the abstract is the abstract of the paper. The presentation is the presentation of the paper. Yes. And so these are very, very common professional tasks, right? Generally, to get into a conference or often to submit to a journal, you have to provide an abstract. And generally, when you publish stuff, you have to write an abstract and it's published with it, right? When you look at journal articles, you'll notice a lot of them start with abstracts. That's less common in the humanities than it is in the sciences, but you still often see abstract and then the full paper, right? Excuse me. Presentations are things we do at conferences, right? Which is where you take your work, ideally before it's published, and you present on it. Here's what I'm covering, here are my thoughts, right? The idealized goal of a presentation is to get feedback from your peers that you then can fold into the publication. The truth of the matter is schedules don't always work like that. So sometimes it's already been published and here I am presenting it. So here you go. But that's just the nature of how things work. Are there any other questions about that?
Okay.
I thought I heard somebody.
Okay, I got another question. Yeah. Okay, so the presentations, since we're doing online only for who knows when, next semester, next 5 years, I don't know, but anyways, so with the presentation, are we gonna just present via Zoom like we are right now, like Sam just did, or are we going to have to record a presentation?
My thought is you'll probably do basically what Sam just did, right? Walk us through what you're doing here.
Okay.
I can imagine people doing something else, like recording themselves just with a camera doing it, particularly people who are going to have difficulty participating in the live sessions or have technical difficulty or whatever. So I envision, there may be some other options there, but I think the default would be basically what Sam just did for her supplement.
Okay. What did Sam use? Was that PowerPoint, Sam, or was that Google Docs?
Or not? Yeah, I use PowerPoint, but you could probably also use like Google Slides or something like that.
Slides? Okay.
Yeah, either way.
As students or as anybody affiliated with UNCW, you have not only access to all the Microsoft products, but you also have Office 365. Does anyone ever use that?
I haven't used anything.
Well, so Office 365 is sort of like Microsoft's version of the Google suite of tools in that they're online, so you can collaborate and share if that's something that's relevant. I tend to use it now with students because I know they have access to it. Whereas with Google Docs, most everybody has a Google account, but not everyone wants to mix those things together. So I tend to steer students toward Office 365 for those kinds of tasks.
So that's like a PowerPoint? Is that like a PowerPoint?
Yeah, it includes online versions of Word, Excel, and PowerPoint, and it's Microsoft stuff. It's just it's scaled down a little bit. It's not quite as feature-filled as the desktop versions of it, but it's accessible anywhere. I mean, you can just log into it and do it. Anywho, other questions right now or?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So about 15 minutes for the presentations. Yes.
10, I believe.
Okay, 10. And also, Totally forgot.
I can't wait to see what everybody has. I think it's going to be so fascinating.
I think so too. Well, I'll tell you what, we'll take a look at these.
I got another question.
Okay.
I just remembered it.
What is it? Uh-oh.
Are you allowed to ask questions after the presentations?
Yes.
Okay. Bless you.
Thank you. It was a cough. I've been doing these all day, literally back to back since 9 o'clock.
Cold weather is a killer for allergies.
Did you hear that one of the symptoms they think of the coronavirus is no smell or no taste?
Yeah.
I immediately thought of you.
Why?
Didn't you say you were taking a blood pressure medicine that makes it hard for you to smell things?
No, I am taking a blood pressure medicine, but it affects memory. It flattens emotions, so it can be used therapeutically to help PTSD. Because
I thought it had to do with taste and smell. I don't know where I got that. Sorry.
Oh, well, my wife actually has issues with her sense of smell because of Zicam, I think it was, or nasal or something like that.
That hurt her?
Yeah, but I mean that's unrelated to the coronavirus, but that is the case. Yeah. Anywho, so that's the gist of the abstract. We're going to be, continuing to look at these. As it says here, students should meet the parameters of their selected CFPs as closely as possible. There's no additional length or format requirements imposed by the course, unless, there is no word count, then we can find one that's going to work for you. They'll be submitted as attached files with copies of or links to the associated CFP, right? So I just need to see what this is in response to. And then we've got our lists here. Are there other questions about this right now? Okay, so the other components of this, the paper, which, curiously has a short write-up, but that's in part because it's probably the thing we're most familiar with. So the course culminates in the production of an academic paper that responds to a CFP in the field of rhetoric. I have a broad interpretation of what that means, right? So, we've been looking at some things like popular culture association, right? Pretty much if it fits under the aegis of the kind of questions we've been looking at, or it takes a rhetorical approach in some way, it's probably fine. I'm going to know what you're doing. But, I take a broad view for what fits under rhetoric. The paper should be approximately 3,000 words. That's about 10-ish pages. I'm not going to count it, but that's trying to encourage a certain level of depth. It also makes it appropriate for a 10-minute presentation.
Holy crap, April 27th? That's next month.
That can't be right, or can it? Oh no, that's right. Well, that's the end of the semester.
Wait, I thought the paper said April 27th.
What's that?
Yeah.
What?
Yeah, they're due together. It's all
crap.
part of the same thing. See, you can't really do an abstract until you've done the paper, because you don't exactly know. I mean, you can, but you don't exactly know what you're going to do. Excuse me.
It's pretty good before.
What's that?
I've done some really good BSing before for an abstract. So
well, that's the thing. I mean, often you can do a really good abstract, and then when it comes time to write the paper, and you're like, I don't even remember what I was talking about when I wrote this. I've painted myself into a corner.
Okay, I also have another question. I just remembered. And when are we supposed to sign up for presentations, or is that on random?
There's no sign up. Yeah, there won't be any sign up for that. Whoever wants to do them.
The alphabetical order.
What's that?
Is it going to be alphabetical order then?
No.
For the presentation?
No, it'll probably be anybody who wants to go, or failing that, I'll probably just throw our names into the randomizer.
But you won't know until the 27th.
Well, we could set it up earlier than that if you'd prefer.
Yeah, I kind of want to know where D-date is.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I mean, we can set them up earlier than that if you want. That's fine with me. Probably not right now, but we can set them up earlier than when they're going to happen. I mean, truth be told, well, no, we couldn't. We couldn't do them all. It's going to take a couple of meetings to do them all. Anywho.
I'll go after Sam.
Yeah, so
did you notice that you're having a response at the same time as the abstract in paper presentation? Did you know that?
What's that?
That you're asking for a response during the abstract, the second one on May 6th. So people will be presenting on the same time as a response.
Well, see, since we're actually doing some reading on that day, this is just the prompt to do it. And since they're split up, it should really only take about a little over an hour technically to do that. So we will have additional time. So yes, we do have some reading and a response. But the thing of it is, this stuff's already in, right? I mean, this is no more, this isn't a bigger deal than really any other week.
Oh, I see what you're saying. It's just a presentation that's different, yeah. And in that any three, so we get to decide, and we're not going to agree as a group, right? We're just all, yeah.
You'll just pick whatever interests you.
Okay.
And there are a lot of choices in that period.
I'll pick the shortest. I mean, the longest.
Sometimes the shorter ones are cryptic. And I think a lot of them are pretty short though, because they're covering a lot of ground there. Anywho, papers should incorporate no fewer than 4 external sources, although this criterion is admittedly somewhat arbitrary. It serves to underscore that scholarly work should orient itself within a conversation through reference to other material. So it's really just asking for 4 external sources. And I'm not really even super picky about, it doesn't stipulate they have to be scholarly sources. So you could be looking at primary material, and that could be one of your sources, right? If you're doing some form of rhetorical analysis on some text or some corpus or something like that, that could fit under this as well.
I'm sorry, can I?
Yes.
So when you say external, are you talking about non-textbook, like not our textbook?
No, you can use our textbook. It just means anything that's not something you're writing. There's 4 sources.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
Yeah, this may be a useless modifier here. Just 4 sources.
Alrighty.
Papers will be submitted as attached files. So, all of this stuff will be asynchronous. You can, upload this, whatever. So that's the gist of the paper. Are there any questions about that? This is probably stuff we've done repeatedly.
Okay, so what if my internet connection suddenly mysteriously drops out when it's my time to present? What happens then?
We'll just do you another time. And if there are people who have serious challenges, as I said, we'll probably just have you record yours and give it to me in another format.
Okay.
There's no situation here where someone's going to be unduly penalized for something that's well beyond their control.
Okay.
Okay, so the presentation. Students will deliver their research in a corresponding presentation of approximately 10 minutes, which generally conference presentations are usually 20 minutes, but we're doing a 10-page paper. A lot of times you think a page a minute. You're probably not going to be reading them, but in terms of content. Presenters should not simply read their completed papers, right? I strongly counsel against that, but rather communicate their material effectively within the rhetorical situation. You can use whatever you want. If you want to use slides, you can use slides. If you don't want to use anything, you don't have to. I mean, I've been in a lot of talks where people are just giving talks, right? They're just talking to you.
So I can use a whiteboard.
What's that?
So I can use a whiteboard if I wanted to.
You could, and in fact, I think there is some capabilities in Zoom where you can actually, they have a virtual whiteboard as well.
Okay.
Or you could have just a tangible one behind you.
Okay.
Yeah, it doesn't matter to me. It matters. It's just that you're allowed to, use whatever you want. This needs to be changed. Students will have access to the classroom projector. That's out the window, isn't it? But you'll have access to our Zoom tools. Presentations will take place in class over the final 2 course meetings. That's still true. Wait, May the 6th. That's not true. Or is it? No, that is true. That is true, because that's our last day technically. So that's the gist of it. Yeah, this is the rest of the semester. You can think of it as 3 related products, right? The big push is going to be your paper. But then we've got 2 related things associated with that. Now, in terms of point value, you can see this is 10, this is 10, the paper is 80, right? So collectively they're 100 points, but you can see, this one is clearly the focus. And in fact, in terms of overall grade weight, 10 is not a whole lot. And, when I evaluate things like presentations, even if this were in person, I'm not going to be going through a checklist of, appearance and that kind of stuff. As long as you're doing a good faith effort at presentation here, you'll probably do fine. I mean, you'll probably do well.
So I can present my PJs and still get a 10 out of 10.
I'd say you could. You could.
Okay.
I mean, I'm still wearing a tie even though I'm at home. So maybe you're asking the wrong guy. But
ethos. It's all about ethos.
It changes the way your relationship to the material. Any questions about these 3? Okay. We'll be dealing with these obviously as we go. So it's not like we're just going to go do these and then we'll meet back again at the end of the semester with these done. As we proceed, we'll do things like start figuring out, okay, well, here's the CFP I'm going to target, right? Here's what I'm thinking of working up here for my paper or my abstract or whatever. Just as we did with the exam, we'll, when we were writing sample questions, we'll continue to work with our current project. All right. Oh boy, we don't have a lot of time. Let's take this opportunity to read a few of our papers. We haven't really talked exclusively about Augustine Boethius or Christine de Pizan. And I haven't really got a chance to go through the responses yet. Who did folks cover? Did anyone cover Augustine primarily in their response? Nobody's not popular?
I somewhat did, I guess. I just compared him to a lot of the other writers we've covered.
Well, why don't you give us what you've got about Augustine?
Yeah, let me pull it up real fast.
Nope, I'm not supposed to touch my face.
I did both of you.
Oh, I'll see if I can turn off. Wait. Oh, I'm sorry. I was experimenting with the backgrounds earlier. So
well, it's working.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, do it.
I know.
Do it.
This is very dramatic.
How'd you do that?
I don't remember. I was just asking my brother because I don't know anything. And I was like, whoa, like I like the Northern Lights one. So you guys are welcome. Anyway, response 6, I put Augustine's work is unique in that it harkens back to the Platonic tradition of absolute truth as opposed to the humanistic Ciceronian model that viewed knowledge as at least partially constructed by language. While medieval rhetoric is known for being dry and uninventive, the outdated novelty of the Platonic tradition at least gave this era of rhetoric a specific flavor to make it stand out among the preceding and following eras, which also resulted in a new branch of philosophy dubbed Neoplatonism. In parentheses, Augustine's The City of God gives a more thorough explanation of his views on Plato's work. Further, as is often the case with rhetoricians adapting the work of their elders for their own purposes, e.g. Quintilian synthesizing past rhetoric to suit his pedagogical needs more fully, Augustine's examination of Platonic, Aristotelian, and Ciceronian logic did make some more in-depth connections between their works. For example, while discussions of the grand, middle, and high style, to instruct, to delight, and to move, were not wanting, it was only through Augustine that the connection between Cicero's three offices and three styles, grand, middle, and high, as well as Aristotle's three branches of rhetoric, forensic, epideictic, and judicial, are made explicit. As Augustine elaborates on page 469 through 470, for it is to these 3 points, viz. Instructing, pleasing, and persuading, that the great authority on Roman eloquence himself seems to wish to apply those other 3 points in that place where he has said, he therefore will be eloquent who can speak in a subdued manner on important matters, in a moderate style on things of greater importance, and in a grand style on great matters. Of course, Augustine is still most notable for his adaptation of medieval rhetoric for religious purposes. His emphasis on hermeneutics or interpretation still guides the examination of Christian doctrine today, though the didactic aspect of preaching he viewed as lesser was probably favored for a time due to the illiteracy rampant during the Middle Ages. However, the two central aspects of doctrinal interpretation no longer center around hermeneutics and didactics, but rather hermeneutics and exegesis. In the modern context, hermeneutics means deciphering of biblical doctrine for application, whereas exegesis is meant to examine the meaning of the text in its original context, though the two, much like in Augustine's time, are still often used interchangeably. However, exegesis is no longer only related to biblical studies, as numerous other religions and even fields of history now use the term to denote a delving into context. And my question was, how would you explain the connection between the three branches, offices, and styles of rhetoric? So yeah, he was sort of tangentially important to what I was discussing, I guess.
Well, no, it's, thank you, right? We usually clap. Sorry, I forgot about that.
Yes, please clap.
For the Northern Lights, if nothing else.
I know, yeah. I kind of am wigged out by it at this point, but
I think it's
you have to find out how you did it and tell us.
Well, I think it's under virtual background, maybe.
I don't remember. My brother's just like, hey, like you should look at the backgrounds before.
It's at stop
really give
video.
You some authority.
Yeah, under stop video, there's some options.
There's a tab, choose virtual background, and you can turn it off as well if you would like that.
Yeah, I'll see. Oh,
there we go.
None. Okay, there we go.
So anywho, so Augustine, what are some other thoughts about what Augustine had to say? Folks we haven't heard from, let's see.
I was just gonna say, one thing that I noticed about Augustine is that I felt like a lot of what he wrote about was he was more focused on content than rhetoric in general. So even if people didn't have eloquence or he talked a little bit about wisdom, that didn't matter as long as he could get that divine truth across to a wide audience. So I felt like that was different from other philosophers that we read about, where they're like super big on the delivery, when for him it was really just like anyway.
Well, so this is interesting, and I think Stevie touched upon this with, he has the Ciceronian model of to teach, to delight, to move, basically. I mean, it's the same breakdown, and he even parses it into, as you pointed out, right? To teach or to instruct, small things in a subdued style, moderate things in a temperate style, and then great things in a grand style, right? But he has the curious kind of position where the emphasis is largely on that first one, to teach. Because if you think of something like a Cicero, where the grandest was to move, right? You needed to move a person to action. That's kind of our loftiest goal. But he's working in a much more kind of democratic, this is toward the good of a democratic state notion, right? Different notion of truth. We're building that to a greater degree in Cicero. For Augustine, we've got the truth. The truth is there in the Bible. Now, not everyone can read it, but the truth is right there. So really, the highest goal here is just to tell them it. It's to teach. It's interesting because it's this inversion where it's like, well, look, we got the truth. We don't need to worry about the grand notion of forming truth. We got it. We just got to tell people about it. We just got to give it to them. So he does have this peculiar emphasis on just what seems to be the smallest one, the teaching aspect. I just need to instruct you, right? Yeah, it's interesting. And it's kind of an inversion of what we see with some classical figures. Yeah, anyone else about Augustine? Do people know of Augustine through any other means? I mean, like through Britain, like through religious stuff, or?
Yeah, I went to a Christian high school. So we, gosh, I don't even remember which years, but we had certain years where we studied different theologians and different other religions as well. So we studied Augustine a little bit, but it was mostly like to build kind of a quick foundation to move on to more modern theologians. So I don't remember anything necessarily specifically, but I was excited to look into him more in this context.
My mom, she never went past high school, and she was in parochial school her whole life, one of 10 kids. And so they were basically there for free because of church charity. And at some point, and I don't know why it was brought up, but in my childhood, I remember my mom yelling, just like St. Augustine, he was a pervert his whole life until the very end, and then he repented.
Good point.
Yeah, that's the only thing I ever knew about him.
Well, that is the case. I mean, St. Augustine is sort of a late convert, not quite that late, although, I mean, even once he did convert. I mean, he's famous for what is the, it's, Lord, grant me chastity, but not yet. I think that's him, right? The idea that, I want to be godly, but just not right now.
Well, I think she was coming from a place of intolerance of hypocrisy. And he was the prime example of a hypocrite to my mother.
But he's a saint.
She was going to be a nun. My mom was going to be a cloistered nun, not only a nun, but a cloistered nun. So, she knows of what she talks about. Anyways, that was the only contact I ever had with that name as a child.
But yeah, those definitely. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead, Stevie.
I was going to say I've definitely only really heard of him in the context of the Confessions.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, before that, I'd never read anything.
And what's the thumbnail of the Confessions?
Basically, yeah, talking about his good times before giving it all up. Even though from what I read, it really didn't sound like he was, attending any orgies or anything. He just had like a mistress on the side and was sort of, uninvolved with anything higher order. So
he like fought against his mom who's trying to get him to convert.
Oh yeah, that's right. That was in the little thumbnail for him. And his father wasn't. I think his father converted later, or no? Okay.
I don't remember. I just remember in what we read for class today, he was like, he wasn't religious, but his mom really was. And then his father died and his mom swooped in and was just like, hey, remember God? And then he kind of switched over and became Christian. And then immediately after his mom died. So.
Yeah, well, and so these are all relevant because, I mean, before he was, in the church, he was a practicing rhetoric teacher. I mean, it's relevant. And so you can see in his work, this incorporation, sometimes a conscious rejection of it, but still an incorporation of it. I mean, it's in the bone where he, points out things about when we're the sort of duty of homiletics, the duty of preaching. And he talks about, and this is something Aristotle said earlier in sort of a gentle rebuke of Plato, where, Aristotle points out, he's like, well, look, lies are attractive. So why shouldn't the truth fight on equal footing? He's like, it would be foolish to say, well, lies can be attractive, but the truth, which should win, has to fight with a hand behind its back. It doesn't make any sense. Now, Plato, of course, even in the dialogues we saw, right, where Plato says, no. If someone, lies or does wrong, that's their problem. That damages their soul, but I'm blameless, right? It's Plato struggling with what happened to Socrates. But Augustine reiterates this. He's like, the lies are out there. We need to save souls. And that means we need to present Christian truth attractively, right? It's foolish to say, well, it's just enough that it's the truth. No, we've got to convert people. Right? And I mean, this is also at a time when that was super important. I mean, for this thing to thrive, they needed souls. They needed bodies. You know, he's writing at a time where he wasn't a Christian because there was lots of other religions. You know,
was it Boethius then who said that the office of delighting wasn't even relevant? I think.
Yeah, he cuts it out.
Yeah, that's right. Okay.
Yeah, he just has 2 of them. Yeah. There's a metaphor in that. Yeah, so that's important for Augustine is, you know, that kind of, he does pick up, I mean, he has these classical threads in him. He has a Ciceronian parsing, even though different ends, right? I mean, you know, he doesn't, as the book points out, I think, doesn't buy into the more mobile notion of truth that a Cicero has implicitly as someone who's a democratic statesman, right? I mean, say what you will, the corner of the Roman Republic was still democracy. I mean, it was still a republic. You know, Cicero died fighting for that. And so Augustine picks up some of these things. He picks up Aristotle. I mean, he's classically educated. He's a rhetoric teacher. He just starts turning it to these other ends, and he's pretty darn effective. And I mean, he's a saint for, you know, for his work. Anything else that folks noticed about Augustine? His relaxed stance to plagiarism. That, you know, it's not anything we have to talk about too much, but he was perfectly fine. He's like, you know, not everyone's going to be good at this, so just steal what works. It doesn't matter. It's all God's. It doesn't matter.
He was talking about homilies, right? He was talking about sermons. That's not the same thing. That's not the same thing.
How so?
Well, even like in 503, we were talking about for the common good, common core, common knowledge. Like when it's not impinging upon someone's career currency, then plagiarism is more than tolerated. It's actually a boon to the person who is writing it.
Yeah, irony of ironies. Plagiarism is the lifeblood of teaching.
Yeah.
Such that it's not particularly even viewed as plagiarism. It's just a different notion of intellectual property sharing. Right?
Yeah.
Augustine has that same kind of notion. Yes, he is talking about sermonizing basically and saying, you know, maybe you're not great at it. You know, maybe you can't think up this stuff or you're just not great in delivery. So just take someone else's, right? I mean, the goal here is it all comes out in the wash. We want to save people. Yeah, and he does parse up, and Stevie, you talked a bit about this relationship between hermeneutics and homiletics, right? And we can even kind of map that to a degree, like when Aristotle talks about the difference between dialectic and rhetoric, right? He says rhetoric is the counterpart of dialectic, right? And they even have their own mechanisms, the syllogism and the enthymeme. Aristotle's such a taxonomist. He has to line things up, right? So this is the counterpart to this. Here's its method. Here's its method. In a similar way, we see in Augustine and others, hermeneutics being, and exegesis as part of hermeneutics at that time, understanding what is Christian truth, right? Explicating the Bible, basically. So what is it actually saying here? That's where we find truth. And then homiletics, which is communicating that truth, right? So those are set up and separated. In a way, analogous, you know, just as rhetoric is the counterpart to dialectic, so too homiletics are the counterpart to hermeneutics. Okay? Dialectic finds truth, hermeneutics find truth. Arguably, then rhetoric communicates and homiletics communicate, operationalizing what you discover. You know, you can only push that connection so far, but I think it's there. Yeah. He also, sort of like the sophists, a weird connection. He resisted codification of, you know, here's a manual for proper, you know, creation of a homily or whatever. Much more of modeling, like emulation, right? Watch people do it. We've seen different notions of imitation. He was, you know, big into that kind of thing. Imitate. I'm not going to give you a handbook. We got the Bible. Just imitate what you see works. Okay. Yeah, ooh, we should move on. So Heather, you did Boethius. Did anyone else do Boethius? Well, I'm not, Kelly, you did as well? Well, let's hear from you both. Kelly, why don't you read yours, and then Heather, we'll have you read, if not all of yours, at least some of it. Okay. Oh, you're muted. Let me unmute you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Pull my computer over. In the medieval texts, rhetoric, although present and still influential, seems to move from the center of the conversation to the background. For example, Boethius seems less interested in prioritizing the study of rhetoric or its capabilities for creating knowledge. Instead, he provides an overview of its functionality as an argumentative model. The headnote provided for Boethius references a quote from James J. Murphy that sums up Boethius' approach to discussing rhetoric. It seems that Boethius wishes only to account for rhetoric, not to explore it, to place it in an intellectual system hierarchically dominated by dialectic. And that was a quote from the book. Murphy's conclusions are certainly evident in an overview of the structure of rhetoric, as Boethius seems to describe the qualities of rhetoric in broad, sweeping terms that seem to focus on the mechanics of rhetoric. In fact, Boethius describes rhetoric as a faculty to be applied to one of the three species: judicial, demonstrative, and deliberative. The definition implies that rhetoric is merely a tool to be employed or action to perform. According to Boethius, successful use of rhetoric is as simple as the speaker knowing that he has spoken in a way calculated to persuade. And that was a quote from page 490. Thus, the outcome of a speech is almost as clear as a computation. This may be the reason Boethius chooses to only speak of two of Cicero's three purposes of rhetoric: to teach and to move, which seems to be outcomes that are more centered around functionality. While this perception may demystify rhetoric, it also seems to reduce it by removing the complexities and nuances we have used in class thus far to define it. After establishing a definition of rhetoric and explaining the species, Boethius moves on to identify the 5 parts of rhetoric and the 6 parts of oration. He states, "For unless the previously mentioned parts of rhetoric are present, that is, unless the author discovers suitable material, clothes it in a good style, arranges it properly, remembers it and delivers it well, he accomplishes nothing." And that's page 489. Keeping with his perception of rhetoric as a faculty, Boethius' description of the parts of rhetoric as tools is reminiscent of a machine. If one part of the machine is missing or broken, the entire mechanism falls apart. I think many would agree that the 5 aspects of rhetoric that Aristotle established are most certainly necessary when practicing rhetoric. In fact, as a teacher and student, the rhetoric I encounter discussed the most is written. In these cases, though memory is less important than in classic or medieval times, the other 4 elements are foundational principles to rhetoric. Yet Boethius declares that all elements must be present to be successful. In fact, he goes as far as to say that if they are not all evident, the rhetoric has accomplished nothing. This declaration is striking to me, as it suggests that achieving success in rhetoric is an all or nothing situation. It caused me to pause and evaluate my own ideas about what can be accomplished in rhetoric if one of these 5 parts is missing. In my experience, each of the 5 parts of rhetoric are not always equally stressed in importance as in Boethius' description. Some teachers or contexts stress style over arrangement or invention over style. In the article Inviting the Mother Tongue Beyond Mistakes, Bad English and Wrong Language, Peter Elba acknowledges the importance of teaching students the conventions of writing and rhetoric that are generally accepted in academia, but he prioritizes invention, arguing that oftentimes students are able to generate the best ideas when they feel free to write in dialects that are natural to them. In this article, and in these cases, a space for students to invent critical, persuasive ideas is an accomplishment. There's not really a question in there, but I guess I was just kind of asking, how do you equally value all 5 of the aspects of rhetoric equally? Are there some that maybe you prioritize over others? Or do you feel like Boethius, that if they're not all present and successful, that nothing's been accomplished? Essentially, that makes sense.
So that's a good question, right? Is this an all or nothing thing? And as you point out, that can be differently valued. You pointed to things like Peter Elbow, and Heather, you've talked about him before. An emphasis on invention. Yeah, we'll see that, the role of invention, because, clearly in Boethius, rhetoric is shorn of its creative capability. It's to communicate. It doesn't make new stuff, right? And pretty much from here forward, for a long time, Rhetoric really gets tied to those 5 things differently, and invention is the one that suffers quite a bit. I mean, it largely becomes just style. Rhetoric becomes synonymous with style, right? It starts to be just the language choices you're using, just the fancy tropes you're using to communicate. And so it loses this creative capability. And so then in more recent history, we see a real reinvigoration of the idea that rhetoric can be epistemic, right? It's not just language. It's foolish to think of things in terms of, well, first I come up with the ideas and then I put them into words, right? The argument of rhetoric now is those are synonymous, right? You think as you put them into words. That's what thinking is, right? Yeah. Heather, what did you have about Boethius?
Okay, so let's see, Boethius and okay. Spark Notes is a student's secret weapon that is common practice. In her 2014 critique on the practice, Alison Bach explains that Spark Notes is more accessible. What?
Sorry, it was breaking up a bit.
Okay. Alison Bach explains that SparkNotes is more accessible than its predecessor, CliffNotes, including being accessible through an app. Bach implies that this condensing convoluted information is relatively new, but this practice has been existent since the 5th century, as seen in Boethius's An Overview of the Structure of Rhetoric. Critics have labeled Boethius and Aristotle rhetoric, page 487. An overview of the structure of rhetoric expresses this in its overview of Aristotle's Principles of Rhetoric on Rhetoric. Boethius summarizes the major points such as the 3 species of rhetoric: judicial, demonstrative, and deliberative, and 5 parts of rhetoric: invention, disposition, style, memory, and delivery. Since Boethius does not mention any other views on the parts of rhetoric, he cements himself as an Aristotelian scholar. In this way, Boethius also acts as a medieval form of SparkNotes, as he breaks down Aristotle's On Rhetoric to its bare fundamentals. Where Aristotle's original spans approximately 61 pages and covers a wide range of topics, Boethius's overview consists of a few pages and focuses on a few principles. SparkNotes, likewise, offers a, quote, broad understanding, unquote, but lacks the details that only reading and the original offers. Boethius may provide Aristotle's major contributions to rhetoric, but omits Aristotle's definitions of pleasure and pain. For these meticulous details, readers would have to push through those 61 pages. Additionally, Boethius likens himself to SparkNotes by offering only one version of rhetorical principles. Boethius exemplifies Bach's criticism of SparkNotes by offering, quote, the correct interpretation, unquote, of a work rather than exposing students to other interpretations or creating their own. Boethius, presents Aristotle's 5 parts of rhetoric instead of introducing Cicero's 4 parts of rhetoric or Quintilian's division of rhetoric. By omitting any other interpretations or complicating Aristotle's, Boethius presents Aristotle's as, quote, the correct interpretation, unquote. Therefore, Boethius's An Overview of the Structure of Rhetoric is no different than the SparkNotes version of Moby Dick or any other work, as Boethius simply summarizes Aristotle and presents On Rhetoric as the only interpretation to rhetoric. Despite being a SparkNotes version of Aristotle, Boethius is included in our textbook. Why is Boethius included as a rhetorician? As he simply does not contribute any novel perspectives on rhetoric. Is this to show how difficult a task it is to refute Aristotle and his principles? Yeah, that's it.
Okay, all right, thank you. That's a good question. And I think there's a lot of truth to that, that this is kind of like a, as you say, I mean, a SparkNote version or sort of a distillation or cribbing of stuff that has come before, but not seemingly, you know, a theoretical examination or an expansion of rhetorical thought. Why do you think he is in here? I mean, you've got limited space. Why is Boethius in here?
Maybe they were wanting of medieval rhetoricians.
Well, there is a paucity for 1,000 years. That's true. Other thoughts?
I think maybe it might have something to do with wanting to illustrate that while some people might have been getting a little bit away from the classical stuff, that there were people that still really valued that. And he's a pretty good example because he just regurgitates what Aristotle says.
Yeah, that it's not as though classical information was completely lost, right? And this was a guy who was, I mean, essentially kind of working for a warlord, you know, writing his letters, and was eventually, yeah, he was eventually killed by him for ostensibly plotting against him. And so that was, what's that?
How do you get employment for writing? How do you get employed as a letter writer for a warlord? Because I'd like to know.
Well, I bet you could do it today. You know, because the rulers at the time were largely illiterate, but they still needed things like, you know, treaties. They still had to live in the world. And so they had literate people working for them. Yeah, I mean, there was a whole cast of, and we won't dip into this too much, but, you know, one of the things the summary pointed out is that a lot of rhetoric at this time codified with letter writing. And that seems like such a small, it's like, why would the whole thing? But if we think of the context, that was politics. I mean, that was political discourse, it was interchange, you know, it's information architecture, it's professional writing. It was the crux of what writing was. I mean, it's how civilizations maintain themselves. All right.
But essentially, that power is in someone else's hands rather than his own.
Then in what?
Then his letter writer has more power than he has then.
Yeah. I mean, that's...
Unless he just...
Yeah, I mean, well, and so it's not super surprising he was executed, right? Because if you're illiterate and someone's running your business, you might be a little suspicious, you know, even if they're completely blameless, as you point out, you just don't have your finger on things. So how do you know what this guy's doing?
I mean, look at Selena. It was her accountant or her manager that was whittling money behind her back.
Yeah, or, I mean... You know, there are certain contemporary events right now, like, well, the recent flap of potentially some governmental officials liquidating stock based on
Senator Burr,
a North Carolina person, right? So, and the sort of some of the defense of this as well, those decisions are all made by money managers. I don't control that. He
doesn't even have that excuse. He's not giving that excuse. He's saying that he did it before the markets crashed and therefore he shouldn't be held accountable for it.
Yeah.
That was what his excuse was.
Yeah, so we'll see. But I mean, that sort of notion of, you know, distributed agency is shot throughout history. No one person, I mean, even, you know, in the classical period, it's not like the emperor could get his hands around the entire empire, right? You have to have people who are adjudicating business for you. Anywho, so yeah, we won't dip into that too much, but if we had enough time, we would, because letter writing, which seems so tangential, was like the crux of rhetoric for centuries. Is, you know, how you conduct business with other people in an era where just, you know, being literate, you know, was special. You got a job. You'd be executed eventually, but you did get a job. You're going to die anyway. It was the Dark Ages. I mean. Yeah, anything else about Boethius? Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting question about like, why is he in here? I think, it is partially, it does demonstrate that certain aspects of classical thought still permeated, right? He does also have this interesting, he's a generation or so after Augustine, but he does have this kind of interesting position of, here's what rhetoric is, but I don't really want to get into it. It's not really, even though I'm a letter writer, it's just not something I'm into. I mean, I'm not even going to acknowledge the existence of delight, right? I mean, it truly was the Dark Ages. We're just going to teach and to move, but there's going to be no.
Okay, forget it.
Okay, so with the time we have remaining, I bet a lot of people had things to say about De Pizan. If nothing else, this is our first significant woman rhetor, right? It's taken until the 1400s to have this stuff. I mean, as we've talked about, certainly there were women rhetors before this time, but we just don't have a lot of stuff. We have references to Aspasia. There are, and then there are a lot of religious figures. And I think the book talked about that. So women rhetors, or women had a kind of rhetoric in religious experience, particularly things like inspiration from God, right? So a woman couldn't be really public unless I've been divinely inspired. So I'm going to go out and speak, in the crowd. And so the novelty of a woman speaking is okay because she's just a conduit through God. We see a lot of that where in order for women to assume a public role, they had to be othered in some way. I'm just a vessel for God, or I'm separate from the culture, either through different things like witchcraft, which, it's often sort of proto-medicine, or I'm crazy, I'm a someone who gives, like Cassandra, I give prognostications, but I'm crazy. So I'm touched in some way by the gods. In order for women to have a public face of rhetoric, they had to be othered in some way. And here, even with Christine de Pizan, the only reason she got this position was because the men around her died and she had to work. Otherwise this probably wouldn't have been allowed.
And also because of her class, if she had been a poor version, and I'm not talking about even just like poor where you're like making do and you have some income. I'm talking about people that have no income. It's like, it's all about class.
Yeah, she was educated, right? I mean, so it's not like she came from nothing.
She knew people,
Yes. Well, particularly through family connections, right? Her father knew people. And
yeah, she was networked in.
And, was sponsored by the French king. So, yeah, I mean, it's not completely like a rags to riches story. But, oftentimes we see Christine de Pizan as sort of like, this is the first, I think as the book pointed, like woman of letters, right? We've got her stuff. It still exists. She's clearly a sophisticated thinker and speaker.
She could have remarried and solved all of her problems, but she didn't want to marry. And so that is basically what she was running away from. Not so much poverty, but marriage.
Well, that's an interesting question. What motivated this? We can potentially see some desire for notoriety on her own terms. I mean, she does have some things that are strikingly feminist. But let's hear from other folks. Those of us who wrote about de Pizan, what stuck out to you? Anybody?
I wrote about it, but I've been talking a lot, so.
Anybody, Simone or Abby, did either of you write about, I haven't heard from either of you, did either of you write about de Pizan or?
I wrote about Boethius, but you guys covered points, so.
Oh, okay. Any other folks write about de Pizan? Oh, okay. What's that?
I did. And one of the things that I really drew on in my response, I think it was in the city, The one about the ladies, the city of ladies.
Yeah, they're confusing because it's the city of ladies and the treasure of the city of ladies. It's the book of the city of ladies and the treasure. It's like, is this the same thing? They're
I think it was the book of the city of the ladies. And I found it very interesting that when she was talking about one of the women, that although she was very respected and she was very knowledgeable and she was lecturing her father's class, she still had to hide behind a curtain. Yeah, and it kind of reminded me of all of these like dress code issues that people are having in middle school and high schools. And just kind of seeing how even though she was very educated and she was very well respected, her image and how she presented herself impacted other people. And then, you know, I'm sure she wasn't dressed scandalously, but, you know, like to them, having a woman up there meant that they were distracted.
Yes.
Well, don't you think it was like a contract though? It's like, okay, but if you're going to do it, you have to stand behind a screen. Kind of like a negotiation.
Well, I don't know, because in the text, she just said, what was it?
It's 4:45, and to prevent her beauty from distracting the concentration of her audience, she had a little curtain drawn in front of her.
I don't know. To me, when I read it, it just seemed like, I don't want to say it's a dress code issue, but today what they're talking about is a dress code issue. And how, you know, we're hundreds of years from when this is written, and we're still kind of having these issues where even though this woman has very intelligent and articulate ideas, she's still forced to hide behind something because her body is what is distracting. They can't look past that. I just found that was interesting.
And the onus is on her.
Yeah.
To do I mean, you know, think of related contemporary discourses where we've seen things like, you know, sexual violence education and how it's parsed up, right? So for women, it's, well, don't wear anything that's too revealing, rather than for men, don't rape, right?
Yeah.
It's, you know, what are you asking for with this, right? So there is this, you know, victim blaming, or the onus is on the woman to guard her treasure of ladies, right?
Right. Yeah, and for one of my external sources for my response, I found this article. I mean, it was written back in 2015, and I guess I could have found one that was newer. But it was interesting because at this particular school in Kentucky, the dress code became such an issue that the student body made a documentary about it. And the principal is quoted saying that in the end, it just comes down to what the girls are wearing. And instead of addressing, you know, the inappropriate behaviors that probably a small amount of male students were doing, they're just saying, okay, well, now all of the girls are going to be penalized for what a handful of male students are doing. So again, like you said, women are being punished for what other men are doing in an educational setting in that particular instance.
Yeah.
And it's on them.
Yeah, what else did people notice? I mean, I think that's completely legitimate. What else did folks notice about De Pizan here?
One of the interesting things I thought was how mine is about the illustrations, kind of. It's about a lot of different things, but one thing that I thought was very interesting is how she used illustrations to tie her city into Christ.
When
like
you say
the
illustrations,
imagery.
do you mean like
She had illustrations for both of her manuscripts. Like, they have 8 of the 8 of, I think there's 12. I can't remember how many extant manuscripts are left, but I think 8 of them, there were illustrations in them. And she used the illustrations, if I'm remembering correctly, I don't want to have to read it. She used them to kind of like situate her, like a feminist version of the Last Supper was one. using prudence as like the I don't want to say the Christ-like figure, but so much the person that's teaching. It's like she really kind of blend. I'm really actually a little surprised that it wasn't seem to be like heresy, because it was so close to presenting a sort of like Plato's ideal republic. It was like she was repeating it, but with all women. But then she, instead of the transcendent sort of thing with the white guy in his head being perfect, she was like, it was kind of like a communal thing. And it's like Christ-like. And I thought it was pretty brilliant. But she did it in such a way that it was not overt. It was like you had to like read all the different symbols. And they said that there's like proof that she, at least on some of the illustrations, directed the artists to do exactly what was done. So it was forethought. It was something that she chose to do. And in a pre-literate society where only the elite really would have access to these books, which were handed down by private collectors, by the way, luckily. And that's probably how they survived.
Well, you can see, because
like
these
guidebooks to women.
Books.
I'm sorry?
Well, so, and these are conduct books, which was a genre at the time, but something novel about this was it wasn't just for the proper lady, right? I mean,
it was for all classes.
Yeah, I mean, it's scaled down to prostitutes, if we want to put it
which is very Christ-like, right? Which is very Christ-like. Yeah.
And potentially associating with what Sam was discussing earlier, there is a sort of prevailing notion that a civilization of women would be less adversarial. It'd be more communal and less predicated on domination. We see that notion recur at different points in history, that a matriarchal society would be built on different pillars.
I think that's just a narrative. I don't think it's just a different type of violence.
Yeah, I mean, well, sorry, Stevie.
Oh, I was going to say, regarding the first piece that Pizan did about the slander, I forget what the title of that one was exactly, but was that Dame Reason or Worldly Prudence speaking with her? It never really clarified.
Which portion?
Let me...
Sure. That was 548. She talks about the 3 causes of slander.
Okay, so it was, from the Treasure of the City of Ladies, because it talked about her mostly using Dame Reason, but it seems like this is something Prudence would say.
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it's not really uber important, but I was just curious if anyone caught that.
And it is interesting that things are personified in this way at all, right? But
I really liked it, yeah.
When it speaks to this notion of a community, right? Yeah, and shoot, we're almost out of time, but we'll probably return to this because, the statements that Pizan makes for things like the education of women, I mean, we see this much later, almost into the 1800s, where we're talking about vindication of the rights of women, right? The idea that women should be educated, that, they have this sort of, I mean, she was an enactment of a public knowledge laborer. I mean, she was a writer, right? That's how she made her bread. And we don't see stuff like that. I mean, there's a really early notion of that, right? And as Chris points out, I mean, it's interesting that this was preserved in ways that, maybe some other things weren't. She wasn't low class, so to speak. Why did this one survive? Why wasn't she in more trouble for this? In part also because she kind of takes pains to point out she's not for a social revolution. She just wants some concessions. She wants concessions.
She wasn't fighting the superstructure because she was very much into keeping this. All she wanted to do was change the education level. She had opinions and she just thought there was a way, there was such a thing as appropriateness. But I thought it was very interesting that she, even in the illustration, she made sure that the elite had their special place and the people, the poorer people had their, and you could tell just by looking at them. So she had no problem with classism,
Yeah, it's one of the complications, and we always have to contextualize these things, but we want to see this, sort of radical proto-feminist in de Pizan. And what we get is someone who has strong opinions about, education, about potentially these kinds of the value of different classes, but
that wouldn't have survived, right?
Well,
it's because she wasn't attacking the superstructure that it was allowed to survive.
Yeah, she's not advocating overthrow. Right?
Yeah,
she's
yeah.
advocating some changes here. It's sort of a, working within the system to make some productive, smaller gains rather than shatter the patriarchy. We don't get that quite some time.
So a woman supporting the patriarchy. It's true, right?
Arguably, but I mean,
she just wants to tweak it a little bit.
But that'll be a conversation about, throughout history, right? To what degree do we work within institutions versus attempt to supplant them?
Yeah, that's true.
Well, okay, so we're out of time. Shoot, we didn't get to, ideally, I would have liked us to not only return to our CFPs as we have, so I guess just individually, since we're now working toward, the abstract, the paper, the presentation, do poke through those CFPs and find ones that are of interest. Ideally, also, we'd even continue our practice of writing an exam question in groups, even though our exam is passed. This will help us prep for future things like the MA exam, right? The second half of the material. Fortunately, we don't have time for that today. Let's see. Is there anything on the checklist they want to make sure we... No, I don't think so. I mean, is there anything else I was going to talk about that I didn't or anything? Okay. All right. So what we'll do is, for next time, we've got, let me pull it up here. We've got some Renaissance folks. Yeah, the email never stops. Yeah, it looks like we've got Peter Ramus, we got Francis Bacon, Margaret Fell, and Madeline de Scudery, who will start the Renaissance for us. Now, and de Pizan is, as we can pick out, a transitional figure. I mean, you can't imagine her writing this as a contemporary of Augustine or Boethia. She would have been executed, potentially. She would never have had the opportunity. It just wouldn't have happened. But you can see, a kind of flexibility in her work that's leading us into the Renaissance. She's a really good transitional figure. So we'll pick that up next time. It looks like we've got Abby and Simone will be doing their supplements. Sam, sort of walked us through how that'll go. But if you do encounter any problems, we'll figure it out. Are there any last questions right now? Okay. All right. Well, thanks for sticking through it with everything. I know everyone's lives are crazy, but hopefully we'll all get through this. So thank you again for your contributions.
You have a great week.
Bye.
All right.
Bye,
See you, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
Hey.
Okay, let's see. I need to suspend the stream here. Things are going to be structured. You'll be able to complete workshops without a synchronous meeting. So, for example, this first one, I asked folks to submit their draft paper. Let's see, where would I find this? It's going to be in YouTube. Nope, I want my channel and my videos. Content. Live. There we go. Live control room.